Hello and welcome to AMC Classroom. I'm William Ford of Atlanta Music Critic. In this episode, we explore the musical thinking of composer Eric Chasalow, whose work bridges traditional instrumental composition, electronic music, jazz, and modernist musical thought. Rather than focusing primarily on career milestones, this conversation examines how composers hear, organize, and transform sound. Chasalow discusses the influence of composers such as Elliott Carter and Mario Davidovsky, the role of memory in composition, and the ways technology can expand the expressive possibilities of music. Along the way, he reflects on jazz arranging, the harmonic language of the Beatles, and the process of learning composition through experimentation and failure. This interview also offers a rare glimpse into electroacoustic composition and the relationship between live performers and fixed media. Whether you are a musician, composer, student, or simply curious about how contemporary music is created, this discussion provides an accessible entry point into some remarkably sophisticated ideas. I hope you enjoy this edition of AMC Classroom. If you found this discussion useful, you can find more thoughtful essays on classical music and its institutions at wford.substack.com. You can also support this channel at patreon.com/Atlanta Music Critic. And as always, thank you for watching. And if you haven't already, please like and subscribe.
Hello.
Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm good. Yeah, it's good to meet you, Eric.
Likewise, good to meet you. I've been looking at what you do. It's actually very exciting.
Well, I appreciate that feedback. I certainly enjoy doing it. Usually I begin with some questions about background because I am a psychologist, and what matters more than background in order to understand how somebody got to be where they are and what they do. And I noticed that you were born in Newark.
Correct. Newark, New Jersey.
What was it like growing up in Newark for you?
Well, I didn't grow up there. My parents were in East Orange, and the hospital was in Newark. And my dad had gone to Columbia University. When I was born, he was still a student and getting a PhD in physical chemistry. And shortly after that, he had a job with a kind of chemical company, which I guess he didn't like very much, but he was recommended for a job with the military working on a program called SOSUS, which is a really fascinating thing. In the last couple of decades, started to learn more about it. SOSUS was a project that was started towards the end of the Second World War to track submarines, and then ultimately to track Russian submarines. And it was involved with sonar and LOFAR, listening for these subs. And it turns out that the propellers on the Russian submarines were designed in such a way that those subs made a lot of noise. Towards the end of the Soviet Union, started being able to make their subs a lot more quiet. The system became somewhat obsolete, and it was turned over to marine scientists at that point and sort of decommissioned. But they could tell exactly which sub. They knew the profiles by using really early digital signal processing with sound. And I always think it's sort of interesting. I ended up involved in electronic music and computer music, which has a very strong connection to Bell Laboratories. And so my father's work led him to the Pentagon, and it was work that ultimately brought him into Bell Labs after just a couple of years at the Pentagon. But I kind of had a magical childhood for a few years where we lived when I was 4 in Key West, Florida, because he's doing this project with the Navy. And then we moved to New Jersey, and then we lived in Bermuda for a year plus a little bit in the early 60s. And that was, for a kid, just really formative, really incredibly magical. Then we moved back to New Jersey, and I grew up in Whippany in Morris County for the rest of my childhood.
What then was the relationship with your upbringing and music?
My family was not musical at all. My mother participated in sort of community theater, and she liked to sing, and she was in some musicals. We had a piano in the house. which I used to play around with. But like a lot of people in my generation, the light bulb went off for me when I heard the Beatles. I was so young, and that music just got me to my core. It was so exciting. And I realized later what it was the harmony more than anything. And hearing what they did with harmony, and I don't just mean vocal harmony, I mean the chord changes they used, Mixolydian mode and using minor fives and all kinds of interesting, the colors of those chords got in my ear, and I really was excited about it.
Was there a song in particular that really got your attention?
That's a really good question. I think there were things about the song If I Fell that I loved, that introduction and the way it moves harmonically from the intro into the verse.
I assume the Beatles developed those songs not based on any kind of formal learning about chord structures and so on, but rather just because it sounded good to them.
Exactly. None of them read music. They played, they listened, and they absorbed things like sponges. When you learn what you need to learn to write the next song, to make the next piece. And then because I wanted to do that, I wanted to really have that and be able to reproduce it myself. Like a lot of kids my age, I started taking guitar lessons. Around the time I was like 8 years old or so, I started taking guitar lessons. I ended up studying jazz guitar for a number of years because I wanted to play rock and roll. I did play rock and roll. And because of that, I ended up in these workshops with Stan Kenton, and I met Sarah Vaughan. We went to our high school jazz band, went to jazz festivals. And I was really fortunate in high school. I just started writing big band charts and learning by making lots of mistakes. And anything I wrote, I would bring to our rehearsals in high school. And we would play through them, and things would sound horrible, and I'd go back and try to make it sound less horrible. And ultimately, I wrote some things that we were okay enough. We played them in concert, we played them at festivals.
When you said you were doing big band charts, what exactly were you creating?
I was writing melodies and then trying to figure out what chords would go with those melodies. I remember this, the very first attempt I made, I didn't even know that there was such a thing as a score. So I wrote alto sax 1, alto sax 2. I wrote the parts out. Trumpet 1, trumpet 2, trombone. And I gave those to the players. So how they lined up vertically, how I figured that out, I don't even remember. Obviously, it was just full of all kinds of mistakes because I wasn't looking at the parts all together and thinking of it as one piece. My high school band director said, well, you might want to make a score.
Ta-da.
Yeah.
When you got out of high school, what did you do?
Well, I went off to Bates College. I'm thinking, well, what am I going to do with my life? And so I had a girlfriend who played flute, and I picked up flute as a doubler because I was also playing saxophone, not just guitar. And so I had heard some of the Baroque flute repertoire, some Handel, Telemann, Bach, and I wrote some my attempts at sort of imitating solo flute Baroque music as well. I heard the sound of these groups of instruments or these individual instruments and got it in my ear and wanted to do it, wanted to have it inside my body in a way. And so I had been doing that, but I had a feeling that making a life doing this was going to be next to impossible. And going off to college was about making a life, making a career. And my father was a scientist, engineer, but really a scientist. And my brothers were scientists. I sort of tried hard to go somewhere where I wouldn't be tempted to try to be a musician, other than I was going to continue doing it, but professionally, maybe I shouldn't do that. I was really torn. So I went to Bates. They had no music major. And as luck would have it, the year I got there, they started a music major. I was studying biology, which I really cared about. I was interested in that. I liked it. And also music. And ultimately, I became a double major in college doing music and biology. I showed some of the big band scores to my college professor, one music historian in particular, George Waterman, who had come from Cornell to teach at Bates. And he looked at this stuff and said, you're a composer. I hadn't sort of said it out loud to myself. I was doing it. But having someone else validate that felt different. And he said, we don't have a composer here on the faculty, but Bowdoin, which was a short distance away, there's Elliot Schwartz, who's a very highly regarded composer and teacher. Why don't you talk to him? Why don't you give him a call and say I suggested you call and see if you can get some lessons? And, I was doing all these different things. So I did that. And I went over and I met Elliot, who became my first composition teacher. And he was very generous and open and flexible and really got me thinking, all I could do was see the things I couldn't do, not what I could do. It's like, gee, I had to learn by making a lot of mistakes. And I felt, a lot of imposter syndrome at this point. All my professors actually validating, well, you're a composer, you're doing it. And Elliot was very gentle, I think, a great first teacher. He gave me I remember this really vividly, a first lesson, which was, okay, why don't you write drafts of 3 different kinds of pieces? One piece is going to be just totally free, just write what you want. The other piece is going to be a 12-tone piece. Whatever, I had heard something about Schoenberg and 12-tone music, but I didn't know a lot about it. And I said that, and he said, well, it doesn't matter what it is. Just write what you think it is. And the third piece, you're going to write in words. You're not going to use music notation. You're just going to describe what happens in the piece and write a little narrative. First the French horn makes a sound, and that again, it can be as free as you like. You can describe kinds of sounds, or you can say there's a D in the middle of the staff, or that kind of thing. And I had never thought about that level of flexibility before. It's like music's something you write notes down. He had this very broad experience of the experimental tradition and had worked with improvisers. We had a concert where they played music by John Cage and a piece by Mario Davidovsky. The Cage performance, in the end, didn't involve any sound. There were projections of this person had realized the piece, but he projected slides that were photographs of Walden Pond. And then the Davidovsky, he played us, I think, a recording of Synchronism 1, which is the flute synchronism. And that got me really excited because I was a flutist and I had never heard anything like that. That's a piece that combined live instrument with electronic sounds, pre-recorded electronic sounds. And that did a couple of things for me. I wanted to know much more about that. And I also was very uncomfortable about the idea of a piece with no sound. And so I looked a lot more into Cage. And at that point, I had gone to the library to try to discover a lot more about music. I felt I knew so little. And I pulled things off the shelf because in those days the records were there, right? The vinyls are on the shelf. And I pulled down 2 records. One was string quartets of Elliott Carter, and the other was sonatas and interludes of John Cage. Very different from the Carter, very repetitive, but with that wonderful world of the prepared piano. Sonatas and interludes is one of the prepared piano pieces that he made because they had this old piano on a truck as he's touring with Merce Cunningham and doing these dance pieces and accompanying that. And so it's this incredibly inventive sound world. And then the Carter, I heard first actually the second string quartet, then I heard the first, both of which I liked a great deal.
What do you like about them?
Well, to me, there was this incredibly dense counterpoint, which I found very confusing, but it sounded like some of the best improvised jazz I had ever heard. There was also a sense of rhythm, a sense of pacing in them, a great deal of freedom. And the second quartet, it turns out, because now I've studied it for a lifetime, you've got each of the members of the quartet has their own repertoire of atonal chords that they draw from to play. So their own pitch world, but they also have their own sense of time. They're actually moving at different tempi in parts of that piece. So there's sort of the idea that you could have a piece where instruments are not locked together in a groove. There's a great deal of freedom, and you can hear not just a counterpoint in the more traditional sense, but sort of different layers at the same time that are independent, and yet you're hearing them at the same time. So Ives did that, and I got very excited about Ives when I discovered about the music of Charles Ives too. But Carter did it in a different way, took it to another level, really. And some of these ideas about the kind of sound world of sonatas and interludes, that counterpoint idea from Carter, and what I discovered about Davidovsky, all of that I've carried forward in my own music in my entire life. And Davidovsky became my mentor and my primary teacher. In fact, I did my graduate work at Columbia.
Where would you fit Elliott Carter in the great scheme of music? You know, I just wrote a essay about the forgotten composers 50 years ago, Ned Rorem, Peter Menon, and even William Schumann. They
Howard
were,
Hansen, William Schumann. I mean, they're
yes,
just
they were
incredible. Yeah.
incredibly lauded during their lifetimes and now essentially forgotten, at least in the concert hall. They are, to me, kind of a forgotten generation. In some ways, Elliott Carter is in a different category than those composers because they were still relying on more traditional types of rhythm and harmony and so on. But Carter's very different. Is that a reasonable description to you?
I think Carter is very different. Carter got to a very different place in so many ways. You know, his earlier pieces are neoclassical, and they're wonderful pieces. They stand with a music of Irving Fine, even the neoclassical music of Stravinsky. The cello sonata is just a marvelous piece that I've heard done by several amazing duos, Fred Sherry and Ursula Oppens, for example, made a recording of that piece, and it's just an amazing piece. And even there, you hear Carter starting to move from neoclassicism into something with a bit more freedom, that's becoming a little more chromatic and with a little more rhythmic freedom. So you don't have this kinds of rigid rhythmic motivic sense that you get in some neoclassical music. It's more fluid. There's more that moves across the bar line. But he made a very conscious break with those string quartet, with the first string quartet especially. You know, he talked about that. He wrote about it, that he was trying to make a break from the past. And so the music becomes much more chromatic. It's not 12 tone per se, but it uses all 12 pitches, uses the entire aggregate. He, instead of thinking about sort of horizontally about all 12 pitches as a row, as a sequence of notes, he thought about partitions of that. He thought about chords, groups of tetrachords or six-note chords, and that was his source material. And again, he wrote about that. Other people, David Schiff and others, have written about that as well. So he's got the sound of those chords in his ear as he's writing this music. I took 2 semesters of sort of atonal theory. One with Alan Fort, who taught at Yale, was really well known for set theory, for thinking about this kind of thing that Carter was exploring, where you take groups of notes that aren't major, minor, diminished, augmented chords, and you start to be able to identify them and what they sound like. The other semester I took was with George Pearl, who did the same thing with a different nomenclature, really. And it got me thinking, doing those classes, about that. It got me sitting at the piano and saying, okay, what is an 0146? I don't want to get into too technical here, but if you use numbers instead of note name, then you can take these, these chord qualities like major, minor, but they're other chord qualities that we don't really have a name for, and you can start to have a way of naming them. And when you can name a chord, you can start to hear it. You know, in ear training with students, right? We say, okay, is this a major chord or a minor chord? And then, is this an augmented chord, diminished chord? Is this a diminished 7, half diminished 7, flat 5? What chord are you hearing, right? And we start to learn to hear those things, and then we can hear them in a musical context. You can do that with non-tonal music as well, right? And that was the epiphany for me, and I think for many people, that if you can start to name these things, to have a way of identifying it and getting it in your ear, then it's material you can use to make your music. Carter wasn't alone in this at all, but there's just such a strength of personality in that music. I think it's very carefully shaped, and even when it gets incredibly complex and incredibly dense, there's a kind of energy to it, and there are these great moments of clarity for me anyway. And I've always been very attracted to it.
If you're setting out to compose something, do you have a blank score that you start to write on, or how do you do that? Because you combine traditional instruments with electronic realizations. How do you do that? How do you represent that?
I am working from memory, and by that I mean um, I have Carter in there,
Hmm.
in my subconscious, in my memory, along with Beethoven and Debussy and John Coltrane and the Beatles, yeah, and traditional Irish music that I have some experience with now, not a lot, but some. All kinds of things are there. And I think of making a new piece as a way uh, of refracting and processing those memories. Now, that's very challenging, actually. I know lots of composers who would say, I'm really worried about sounding like something else or sounding like someone else. But for me, I really embrace that, the fact that there are just so many influences. And the challenge is to make something new from those memories, which processes it enough. I'm in dialogue with the past, with those memories at all times. I've taught at Brandeis for many, many years, about to retire. I mean, actually this week, pretty much done.
Congratulations, I guess.
Thank you. Thanks. It's very exciting. So I feel very much part of a lineage and a kind of uh, that kind of tradition and history. That I'm in a department that was founded by this whole group of Stravinsky neoclassicists. They call themselves the Boston neoclassicists. Irving Fine, Harold Shapiro, Arthur Berger, Leonard Bernstein. And they were all very closely associated with Aaron Copland as well. And I don't think of myself as a neoclassical composer at all, although Harold Shapiro used to say, you don't think you are, but you are. And I felt a little defensive about that when he first said it. And then I thought, well, this idea of processing memory, of taking things that already exist and creating a new piece out of it, which I've been doing for a long time. I just didn't have a focused way of describing it until recently. That's a way of sort of extending that tradition, really. I think of it as metaclassicism because there's just multiple layers. Instead of neoclassicism, it's metaclassic music, metaclassical music. What do you do? How do you start? Sometimes it's very deliberate, in almost an Ivesian way with quotation. With Ives, it's like stream of consciousness. With me, it's not that way. It's not sort of whatever pops up at the moment and I find a way to weave it in. Although in the process of writing the piece, that could happen. I'm thinking about a piece I wrote in the late 90s for electric guitar and fixed media. So there's a live electric guitar on stage and then fixed media being played back. And I started with Jimi Hendrix samples, right? So there is something iconic, which is really challenging because any listener, as soon as you hear the voice or the guitar of Jimi Hendrix, it's like name that tune. You're now listening to that. So I have to say, I hope I'm a good enough composer. I try to be a good enough composer that you get engaged in the piece I've written and you stop hearing what the source is pretty quickly. So that piece opens with a direct quote, just a measure or two from Purple Haze. And then the guitar goes off and does this thing that's sort of processing almost like Pope Bob, guitar. It's streams of notes in the guitar.
And
But
do you write that down?
and I write it down.
You write it down. Okay.
I write in a very improvisatory way. So I write a line, I write it down. I might write down 5 or 6 different things and choose one of them that goes into the piece. And with a piece that's combining live instrument with tape, now fixed media more generally, it actually was tape when I started doing this. I I will make the beginning of the piece and figure out what the relationship between those two things is, the live player and the tape, to get that right and really hear it. So I'll write a few measures, maybe between 4 measures and 10 measures of music for the live instrument, and say, okay, what are the electronics doing? Compose that against it. Are they working together? And then I will realize in the studio the electronics and hear how that works. Because what I'm imagining may or may not work. And, I mean, almost always there is some editing, a lot of editing that goes on at that point. But that's so much of composing is about editing, having an idea, just writing it down, not being afraid to write down something that might not be a good idea, doesn't work, and then pushing it and editing and until it becomes something that really works as a beginning, as a piece of music.
Do you go back and edit the fixed media soundtrack, or is it fixed from the get-go and you write in response to it?
I don't write in response to it. I create both of them as I go.
Okay.
So that they work together. Now, that said, I used to say to my students, because I teach this a lot, it's one of the things people would come to study with me to work on. And I would say, don't make your tape part, don't make the electronics, and then write against that, because you need the flexibility to go back and forth. You don't know what it's going to be yet. I had one student who just, and he was right, didn't listen to me, and did exactly what I said you really probably shouldn't do. Actually, I said you shouldn't do it, and made a brilliant piece. So there's no formula for composing. People find their own way of doing it. But for me, I need that back and forth so that these things evolve together and continue to be an interesting dialogue with one another, or make the counterpoint right. Because a lot of the times the electronics is expanding on what the instrument does. And so as I discover what the instrument's going to do, at least one of the layers in the tape part is not traditional counterpoint like what you would get on a piano accompanying the instrument. One of the things that happens in those electronic parts is it's like doing live electronics, where that part changes the sound characteristics of the live instrument. Maybe you play a note on the piano and the electronics adds overtones that wouldn't be there, right, along with it. Or it adds a bass note to it, or it changes the attack so that it sounds, the way the note sounds right at the beginning is very different, or the way it decays, or it sustains, because when you play a piano note, it dies away naturally. Maybe you use the electronics to not let it die away, or the pitch bends, it could change.
How do you create the sounds on the electronics? What do you use?
I use everything at my disposal, but I like to do a kind of super music concrete. So which means I'm using pre-recorded sounds and editing those rather than synthesizing from nothing. But I'll use electronically created sounds as well. Sort of everything goes into the mix. And so the best example would be my piece Crossing Boundaries, where I pulled for source material answering machine tapes from the 80s, high school recordings of my big band charts, oral histories of composers, which my wife and I created this archive of oral histories, which is a whole other discussion for another time. Interviews with my grandmother, with my father-in-law, things I did playing flute, improvisations. I pulled all of that together, and some of it you hear what the source was. Some of it is so highly manipulated that it becomes another sound world. And for me, that's very exciting, that whole continuum going from something you recognize, the ear recognizes right away as, oh, that's a violin, or it's a flute, or it's the human voice, to something else that's fantastic and we couldn't imagine.
Incredible. I just want to say goodbye because Zoom is unceremonious when it cuts us off.
Thanks.
Hey, I appreciate it a lot. It was great talking with you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate you doing it. You too.
Bet.
Take care now.
Bye.
Thanks for watching this edition of AMC Classroom featuring composer Eric Chasalow. What makes this conversation so remarkable is the way it connects science, memory, jazz, modernism, and electronic music into a deeply thoughtful exploration of how contemporary composers actually think about sound. If you enjoyed this discussion, please like, subscribe, and share the video, and visit wford.substack.com for essays, interviews, and commentary on classical music and culture. You can also help support future interviews and AMC classroom content at patreon.com/Atlanta Music Critic. And as always, thank you for watching